All right, well, welcome colleagues. It's a pleasure and a delight and a privilege to be asked to say just a few words at the occasion of this book launch, and I'm delighted to be able to do that. I think I've made no secret of the extent to which I'm very pleased and indeed proud of the way in which disability in education has developed within the faculty over the past few years. And it really has taken off. Colleagues know that we now have a department of disability and education, which I think is a huge step forward. We also are looking forward to the introduction of a full single honours degree in the subject as well, which again I think is absolutely a step in the right direction. And I'm very pleased and very privileged to be part of the things that are going on here. So thank you very much indeed. We can always depend on David and Claire and others to provide us with an opportunity to have a little bit of a celebration and have some lunch. And yet again, it seems like we were here hardly any time ago at all, and we're here again to welcome the appearance of a new book. Very, very prolific department indeed. Dr. Bolt and Dr. Penketh, Claire and David, have been responsible for the editing of this collection, but I know that several other colleagues have also been involved in the writing of it. An edited book, of course, is the production of many scholars, and at least some of those have come from our own ranks, as it were, and we're very privileged that others also from outside have been able to provide some guest chapters as well, so that's great. The particular occasion of the appearance of this book is actually got a bit of a historical background to it. That is, a couple of years ago I had the privilege of addressing very briefly again the representatives of a conference here, and that was the occasion actually also of the launch of the Disability Studies MA, and I could talk a little bit more about that really. The MA itself has taken off, and when I go home in the evenings, it's usually just after 6 o'clock, I happen to walk through the building and I quite often see different MA courses taking place. I have to say David's class is always the one that seems to have the most students in it. It is, I mean, it's 20, must be 20 odd, certainly.
10 on a Monday, 20 on a Wednesday.
20 on a Wednesday. No, that's great. I mean, for master's provision, that's a really good number. So further signs of the way in which the work is appreciated by others, in that case, students. And I'm particularly privileged in that my own son, as some of you will know, is a graduate of that course and did a Disability Studies MA, I think probably the first year perhaps that it was running. Got a very good mark, I have to say. Distinction, actually. And was earned. And just a very brief update, he then took PGCE through School Direct and is now working in a school in Oldham. And I speak to him at least twice a day. I speak to him every morning at 6:30, would you believe? Mainly to make sure he's out of bed, which he always is, which is a bit of an adjustment to my thinking, really, to imagine he's out of bed at 6:30 in the morning. But he's always up, but I just check just in case. And then I speak to him again in the evening just to see how the day went. And I have to say, I'm enormously proud of the work that he's doing there and the maturity with which he's undertaking it. It's incredible, and I'd be happy to share some of those stories with you, but the master's degree certainly prepared him well for that, along with his postgraduate certificate of education, and you can be sure, absolutely sure, that good work has been done as a result of that. Here we have a young man who in this case happens to be my son, who's out there doing good things, which he would not have been as well prepared to do had he not taken that course. So it's delighted to be able to reflect on that as well. The Centre for Culture and Disability Studies does have a growing reputation in the field for the innovative work that's been done in bringing together humanities and the social sciences. And again, we could reflect on Ria's rejoining of the department, and we're looking forward to everything that I'm sure will come about as a result of that new edition as well. And we're looking forward to Ref 2020 or Ref 21, whatever it happens to be, and planning carefully for that. So this is a joint project. It's a project which has been edited, as I say, by David and Claire, but in which many other people have been involved. And it's a joint project also in the sense that it's coming out of a centre, the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, which has this growing reputation, has a very thriving master's degree, and we very much hope in the not too distant future that we'll also have some guests from overseas doing doctoral studies, and we also hope we have some of our own doctoral students within the department and the centre as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words. I could say a bit more about the book itself. I think I'll probably forego that because I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about the book and get a sense of what it's about. And at this point, I'll hand over if that's appropriate. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming to this book.
Okay, well, thanks, folks, and thanks, Kenneth. That was a really nice introduction, and it's good to know that Stephen's doing all right there. And I should follow that in saying that actually we've, as well as having Ella here, who also got a distinction, we have Harriet, who is one of the more recent distinctions. We actually got 2 more distinctions this year, Harriet being one and Jeanette being another, although she unfortunately isn't with us today. She's on holiday. So, you know, obviously anyone who completes that course we're very supportive of, but we can't help being that extra bit proud when it's a distinction. I think it just makes a nicer story. Okay, but as Kenneth said, I'm here to focus on the book in particular, and it's nice to mark out a moment to kind of celebrate, you know, this. Well, something, you know how it is, you know, you think, oh, if we can ever get that book done, it would be fantastic, and you think what will happen when you do that. And then it happens, it comes through the post, you hold it, you smile, you go and tell somebody else, and then you move on to the next thing, and that's how it is. And I think since Kenneth has been, you know, Dean with us here in the Faculty of Education, he's kind of made it quite important for us to mark these things with a bit of celebration. And I think that's quite nice, and I think it's especially nice today that we're able to extend beyond, if you like, faculty members. We've got undergraduate and postgraduate representatives here as well, and you know, indeed people from external to the university. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And I should stress that there are quite a few people overseas who would have liked us to link up by Skype, and who obviously can't make it for a couple of hours in the UK. I kind of discouraged that because I thought that would be more complicated with Skype links. I don't know what your feelings are on that, but I admit to being the kind of issue there. So I'll just give a tiny bit of history, as it were, to how this book came about. And how this work on avoidance, which seems to be one of those few words that I know and therefore keep repeating, and anyone who's worked with me or who's been taught by me will know that I'm not exaggerating on that point. Some time ago, I mean, the original idea, if you like, for this, for where this all came from, is actually in a book in 1954. Have you got that slide, Claire, which is the Allport one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, many of you will know this book much better than I do, but Gordon Allport put forward this model, and I've got a kind of brief outline of the model there on the screen, that suggests how prejudicial behaviour comes about in the world, as it were, the kind of reality of prejudicial behaviour. When I first came across this, actually, was 20 years ago when I was doing an access course, because I thought I might get into education. And during that course, I you know, got a scanner and scanned in this book and found this page, and it had this thing done by Gordon Allport, or Gordon Allport, however you might say it. And what struck me straight away about this is the position of avoidance. That avoidance was seen as kind of more extreme than anti-locution. And I should stress that the thing about this model, the way it works, those of you who are not so familiar with it, is the idea being that those less extreme forms of prejudicial behaviour are not necessary. They are necessary conditions of the others, but they aren't sufficient conditions of the others. That's the point that Allport made. And what I mean by that then is that that those things need to be in place before the more extreme forms are put into effect. So there is a kind of link between something like avoidance and the most extreme things that happened in Nazi Germany and so on. And the other thing that struck me at the time was the lack of reference to disability in all of this. The examples, understandably, in a book that came out in the mid-50s, and it's quite a thick book, so obviously it took some time to put together, was obviously referred to Nazi Germany and specifically to, if you like, the Jewish Holocaust, whereas now we would be more considered perhaps and extend that to involve the people who were used at the beginning of all of this, where disabled people were literally experimented on as part of that devastating part of history, as it were. So that struck me then, 20 years ago, and as I say, so it was a little bit of knowledge, which, as ever, I kind of took a long way, i.e. kept repeating. And then I moved on a little bit, I would say. If you can just move on to that next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had an invitation to write for this book, which I was over the moon about. I should stress it went to my old email address, so I very nearly didn't pick it up. And I should say also that my colleague who's in the room here, Anna Bay, is also in this book, and I would recommend that you read her chapter. I very nearly missed the opportunity, but I was over the moon. I had this email from Nick Watson, and those of us in the field know that that's someone who you like to have emails from. I was kind of working on something, didn't really think it was going to be good enough, to be honest, but I did sketch it out, and then I kept working on it, and then I submitted it, and it all went well. And what I did is I took that idea that came from Gordon Allport and specifically related it to the educational setting, insofar as I brought in this idea of critical avoidance. And in brief, the thinking is that avoidance that we find in society, the avoidance that was recognised by Allport, that we also find within the academy, and at all levels of the academy. I do actually mean within schools as well, within FE and obviously within HE, and indeed within variants of that and extensions of that. The point being that in all of the artifacts that we use in teaching, in education, disability is always found, but in the critical work that we draw on to engage with that, we don't often find disability studies. So that was my kind of premise for this work, which obviously is a form of avoidance, and I termed it critical avoidance. And I think it's a useful concept because very quickly I found that was applying to various other things. I mean, most obviously when I talked to some of you a few years ago when I first arrived here, which I guess is 7 years ago now, I talked then about history, the way in which history is often taught without reference to, if you like, disability history, which obviously is part of history more broadly. I mean, some of you know, that I'm the editor of a journal that relates specifically, or started initially, related specifically to literature, and then went on more broadly to culture. All of these areas we often teach but don't draw on disability studies, which I think is patently problematic. So that's what I meant at this stage by critical avoidance. And then if you can just move us on a little bit there. And then this is kind of perhaps the most important development of this work, which is when we did a conference here, as Kenneth said, a couple of years ago. We'd done conferences before, but this one, things really moved forward rapidly. And obviously Claire's involvement with that was largely responsible for the kind of the advancement of this. We went from having we doubled the numbers basically, and just for the record, we also doubled the numbers again this year. So things, around the world, we are known for the work we do here. I say that with an unashamed sense of pride for my part in that. And at this conference, it was specifically organised around that concept of avoidance, and in some cases specifically critical avoidance. And the good thing about that was that obviously it really set us up nicely to put a book together, because rather than doing it retrospectively, or rather than drawing links together and then doing the book that way, this time we had something right at the heart of it, which ultimately was this concept of avoidance that came from Allport. Okay, so if we, and I should say that because many of us here are in the book, at that conference, obviously not everybody did work for the book, and I'm thinking specifically there of Ria Cheen, who also did an excellent presentation at the conference, but isn't in this collection. She was working on something else at the time, so unfortunately she's not involved in this particular book, but her presence was significant at the conference that kind of fed into this book. And obviously all those of us who were here talking about our chapters were at the conference. I hope you see what I mean there. Okay then, so...
Next one. Yeah, so the book.
Yeah. Okay, what's on that slide? I've forgotten where I am.
Part 1, Challenging Institutions.
Oh yes, that's it. Yeah. So the book is divided into 3 parts then. So I've talked about avoidance more broadly, and this specifically then, first part, institutional avoidance, the second part, disciplinary avoidance, or if you like, the avoidance of disability studies within different disciplines. And I should say, that was the strand we picked up on the conference this year, and indeed we have a module on that specifically on the disability studies MA. And then the third part is the critical avoidance that I've just talked to you about, roughly speaking. So those are the 3 parts, and I'm really pleased now that we've got some of the authors here who are going to chat to you a little bit about their chapters. And so the first one, by my memory, which is not good, is Joel Petrie, Dr. Joel Petrie. And now Joel is actually from an external scholar, so special thanks for coming in, Joel. So if we can ask you to do a few words.
Before I talk about my chapter, I'm just going to just like to thank David and Claire for the opportunity to be here, but more importantly, really to have a chapter in the publication. I'm particularly grateful to David for the doctoral promotion, because I'm actually only about 18 months into my PhD. Unless it's an honorary thing and I should expect a letter from Professor Pillay in the next few weeks, I'd be very happy to accept. The same thing happened to me, interestingly. I'm on the editorial board of the Journal for Further and Higher Education, and they insist on writing to me as Professor Petrie. And I think it says something about, I'm not a professor either, obviously, and I think it says something about what we... There are norms that we expect when we meet people. And I think there are norms that we expect when we meet people in academic contexts. And there are norms in relation to disability. I'm just going to talk very quickly about something I saw this week, which I found fascinating. And it was about wonky vegetables. Did anybody see it? It's this program about the fact that we throw away tons and tons and tons of vegetables because they're atypical. There was a farmer who went bust who was a parsnip farmer. And the supermarkets won't take parsnips which are too long, or too short, or too fat, or they've got a slight split in them, and they just all get ploughed back in. And these people are going under as a consequence. The biggest crime if you're a root vegetable is being slightly knobbly. I'm not going to extend that metaphor any further, but I think you can perhaps see where I'm going in terms of disability. I felt a bit of a fraud in a way being involved in the conference and the book, because my background is not disability studies. I am a disabled person. I identified as having an impairment, but the research underpinning the chapter was actually within the frame of leadership and management studies, really, and particularly around trade union involvement in disability equality. And it came about as a consequence of a report that looked at all of post-compulsory provision within the UK, possibly not Scotland actually, FE and HE, and it looked at how disabled staff were treated within those institutions. And the report that came out as a consequence was called the Commission for Disabled Staff in Lifelong Learning. It came at an interesting point because it was post-DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, but prior to the single equality. And without going into the legislative kind of detail, essentially the DDA made a very strong case for the active participation of disabled people in institutional policy making, etc. That expectation, that lever was reduced by the time we got to the single equality. So the study was within the period of post-DDA, pre-single equality, when there was a very strong legislative imperative to involve people with disabilities. And the Commission essentially said that there had been a widespread systematic failure, which amounted to widespread systemic discrimination against disabled professionals. The case study was one institution and essentially found the same thing, that there was an awful lot of rhetorical stuff about inclusion and involvement, but rather less reality when you got onto the rhetoric, significantly less. And one of the interesting things that happened within the case study college is that disabled staff who'd been involved in groups to assist HR, etc., in formulating policy, ultimately withdrew their labour. They said, we're not prepared to continue being involved in a flawed tokenistic operation. So, in a sense, it was a slightly depressing piece of research. But on the other hand, there was a kind of collective muscularity came out of that process, and people who were disabled, who'd had some faith in the processes, started to think we need to articulate our needs in a different way and in a way which is going to be heard. I'm only supposed to be talking about my chapter. I'm going to just very quickly say what I think is a strength of the book, in a sense, which is the fact that it's got things like a chapter which is not from a disability studies perspective, and the fact that it's bringing lots of other things which are cultural, etc., into the mix, I think is really positive in terms of the non-ghettoisation of disability in an academic context. And there's a quote which I use, which is from a book, and I can't remember which book, with apologies, David, but it's a quote from David and Professor Dan Goodley, where they talk about the necessity of building progressive alliances in relation to disability and disability studies, pulling in other traditions, so that it's not just something that's in a ghetto again. And I think that's one of the things that the book does very well. And I'll finish with something that Paul Macney said at the launch of the Commission for Disabled Staff. Paul Macney, some of you will know, as being the former General Secretary of NATFE and UCU, the trade union for academics. He also identifies as being a disabled person and chaired the Commission for Disabled Staff. And he had this lovely turn of phrase. He was talking about the fact that in legislation, institutions, organisations are required to make reasonable adjustments. And he said, I'm not interested in reasonable adjustments. I'm interested in unreasonable transformations.
I just said, should I introduce the next person? And then I said, it's me, talking about Owen's work. So unfortunately, Dr. Owen Barden can't be with us. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Owen's work. He, building on previous work that Owen's done around dyslexia, working with young people and thinking about the possibilities of technologies, Owen's gone on here to explore the avoidance of a field called new literacies, and he's critiquing educational practices that reinforce apparent problems of so-called dyslexics, who by definition must struggle with literacy. And he draws on some really influential work by somebody called Brian Street, who talks about new literacies, and that's been adapted to academic literacies within the higher education context, certainly. And he examined the idea of hegemonic power that exists through particular literacy practices that emphasise individualised approaches to literacy and literateness. Within the chapter, Owen then proposes that we acknowledge ideas around the social model of disability and how that can be applied to a social model of literacy, which would be derived from disability studies and a disability studies framework. That's all I'm going to say about Dr. Owen's chapter. And I'll just introduce Alan to come and say a few words about his work. Thank you, Alan.
Might I begin by thanking the editors of this text, David and Claire, for the opportunity afforded to me to publish in this highly influential edited volume. So I've been asked to provide an overview of my chapter, and I thought I'd do some notes to stop me rambling, so we'll see how we go. Okay. The ontological formation of the word avoidance places it in the 16th century as an act of emptying out, and from the 1600s as an action of making legally invalid. So informed by the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, I seek in this chapter to reveal how school textbooks act as the majoritan, to categorise, contain, constrain societal conceptions of the other, and in so doing how they empty out and invalidate the lives of disabled people. In addition, I, like Petra Krupper's, sought to subvert the structural position of disability as a marker, and to reveal how the representation of disability is structured to contain the other, to isolate it, present it outside normal society and bodies. In this chapter, then, the school textbook in England is recast as an ontological envelope that enfolds this unresolved dialectic between constituted and constituted power into the education of every single school child. Such envelopes, I contend, enfold, constrict and constrain individualisation through what Latour would call impoverished representations, sealing such smoothed out image within totalising structures of modern power and ableist agendas. But my thoughts in this chapter didn't dwell on totalitarian government nor on totalitarian dictatorships who openly construct textbooks as ideological transmitters of power, for example in China or North Korea. Rather, though textbooks were examined as operationalised within supposed democratic systems, where covert forms of manipulation, pronomial games and illocutionary mirrors reflect and impose lexis, an unresolved dialectic between constituting and constituted power. So in this chapter, then, I examine these imposed binary dialectics through a sociological study of disability, so as to unearth the conditions of exclusion experienced by people with impairments. Within education, I suggest in the chapter then that exclusion, striates individual bodies. It striates freedom and social justice as the information communicated through textbooks impose semiotic coordinates, which, as Agamben might say, maintain a delicate balance between modest imprecision and mannerist stereotype. So avoidance of impairment then within school textbooks, in my mind, is a form of a machine of disablement, which, like Deleuze and Guattari's machine in racism, seeks to produce a hegemony determined by degrees of deviance to an individualised, created and normalised form. By cutting and tearing these bodies from the surrounding, then, this machine, I believe, eviscerates the historical and contemporaneous lives of disabled people, as the impaired body becomes inscribed as subject, objectified, and then devalued as object. It is my belief, then, that textbooks' seeming avoidance of disability and disability issues, therefore, characterises a regime of becoming, a covert, creeping, pernicious, cancerous power, which, as Deleuze and Guattari tell us, is steeped in illusion. Textbooks then, therefore, unfold and enfold power from innumerate points in their act of emptying out of the rich and proud lives of many disabled people.
And can I introduce my colleague Laura Waite? I too have written notes because those who know me know how much I can go off task. So Claire and I obviously have got a kind of professional background in disability, so our chapter really
works with that background. So our chapter starts by charting how special educational need has emerged as a field of study in higher education. It's relatively new. And it explores how tensions can arise in university programmes, which must also then align with professional standards. While this particular chapter focuses on teacher education, many of the ideas examined could just as easily apply to other types of professional training that takes place in university. And in fact, it was only this week, teaching with the MA, that this, I use this chapter as a way of looking at my own professional background in social work and speech and hearing therapy, and being able to apply the same concepts. So we consider how the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education stipulates that students should emerge from university education with an appreciation of the uncertainty, ambiguity and limits of knowledge, but that typical studies in SEN works within a framework that critically avoids this, and one that reinforces deficit and remediation. We argue that this framework conflicts with schools' legal responsibilities to promote disability equality and undermines the government rhetoric that urges the voice of disabled people being heard. We reject the idea that critical thinking is just a set of generic skills, and drawing on the work of Adrent, Freire and Hook, we argue that as academic tutors, we cannot be detached from the moral, ethical, social and political. At the end of the day, SEN does not operate in a vacuum. Finally, we assert that working with SEN, a subject that sits between the demands of university education and government-controlled professional training, and then the competing moral, ethical and political frameworks that this position creates, actually provides the perfect conditions for enhanced critical engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So, just to conclude, and it was nice actually going back. David said, actually, what your job, you must bring the book and keep clutching it and show the physical artifact to people. So I'm doing that. And also, my job in the book and also here was to have the last word. And I know Phil's still here. Alex Owen's gone, but of course other members of the senior management team know that that's quite a frequent occurrence, is that I always have to have the last word. So, so here it is. I was also taken back just looking at the epilogue to the book, that it did make me physically smile when I started looking at it, because it started from the premise of this was about the conference, and it instantly sort of took me back. This was the space that we were in. And it was fabulous just having a range of different people together, hearing those discussions. What was also fabulous about the conference, as anybody who's organised a conference, actually I've got my colleague here, Jeff Adams, who's just come in, and we've just run a conference last weekend. And anybody who's run a conference knows that you start off with a plan and you constantly have to adapt, readapt and rework that plan. And one of the great things about the conference was that, different things happened, and we just had to respond in a very creative way to that to ensure that the event went on. And it was a very successful event. So it does take me back, being in this room, to that event in 2013. And although the book, obviously we've got the book, and that's what we're here to celebrate, but that is, in some ways, just thinking about that as being words on a page. And I think the strength around this is that it was a real collaborative endeavour. And it is, it's a physical representation of the good people work that we do. And I think that's, for me, for the department and the people that I work with in the department, I know that that's something that people do very well. So the people work is important. So the final part of the book was recognising the idea of bringing things together, and that idea about being with. So I'd drawn on the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, who had that ontological perspective, which is a relational ontology around being with. And in recognising being with, we recognise the connections and how people are brought together. But importantly, Nancy also recognises the separation and the points of departure. And it's really important for us to recognise where things come together, but also the distance, and to see the distance between people and ideas as being very, very productive spaces. So in the epilogue, I actually examined this idea, what happens when we fail to bring people together, and that we must still recognise, as I say, those points of discontinuity and separation as very, very rich resources. Just to conclude now, I think we are just about ready to finish, but obviously I want to thank everybody who's involved in the publication. Personally, I really want to thank David, and as I acknowledge in the epilogue, this is a project that David started long before I was even around. So it was very encouraging for me to be involved, as we were both involved in editing that volume, and I benefited from David's considerable experience in editing work. I also think it's important, just as we finish, to think about what we can do and what we can make where we bring things together, where we can bring people together. And although we have a lot of pressures to write, we've got a big pressure around ref and around research, but I think what we're doing is essentially quite a creative endeavour, and that requires a real generosity of spirit. So I'd also like to thank Kenneth. Unfortunately he's not here, but I'm sure he'll watch the film again. And to thank Kenneth, because there has been a real change for us in terms of the department, in terms of recognition and value of the work, and that's been very, very important for us as a department, and that's enabled us to develop the conference and the publications. As I say, thanks again to colleagues within the university and out with, and for joining us today. And that's all. I think we'll finish there. So thanks for coming. Thank you.